Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. I am back with another Old Norse lesson for my Patreon supporters, and frustrated because I recorded about 35 minutes of this long video and then my phone shut off for some reason. So this is great. I've been slow to get to this topic, even though y'all need it pretty bad. Because I knew how much work it would take, I knew how long it would be, I knew how many examples I'd have to drag up, and how much text I'd have to add to the video, etc., etc. But I'm ready to do it, and I hope y'all are too. So let's talk a little bit about the subjunctive. Now, for people watching my channel, it is very likely that they know English. I guess not guaranteed, but pretty likely. Second most likely language someone is going to know watching my channel is Swedish, according to YouTube stats. Well, neither English nor Swedish has a living subjunctive category, but each one has the same subjunctive fossil. Very same word. So think about in English, if I say, he talked to me as if I were a thief. Not if I was a thief, right? You could say that. That doesn't sound completely unusual in modern English, but we still often use were rather than was after if to indicate that something is particularly untrue. Same thing in Swedish. Han talade till mig som jag vara en tjuv. Right? Vara, not var, after som or som om, as if. So what this were or vara in Swedish is a remnant of an old category called the subjunctive that was alive and well in Old English and Old Norse, and indicated either a lack of commitment on the part of the narrator or speaker to the truth of what was being said, either because it hasn't been proven, or it's just something that someone else said, or it's just something someone fears, or assumes, or believes. You might call it the form of the verb for when the action might just be taking place in someone's head, right? Rather than in reality, right? So as if I were a thief. I'm not a thief, but I'm a thief in his head. So it's not that I was a thief, it's as if I were. Now, were in English, the subjunctive form, looks like the past plural, right? Rather than the past singular, right? So as if we were would be the same indicative and subjunctive. That's not a coincidence. The verb be is a strong verb, and strong verbs form the past tense subjunctive from their past plural root forms. So that's actually a very meaningful fossil of that formation in English. In earlier modern English, say Shakespeare, if you read a fair amount of Shakespeare, you will see a little bit more subjunctive. Mostly in something like Shakespeare, that's going to take the form of verbs not having S in the third person singular where you would expect them to. So, if he tell the truth instead of if he tells the truth. That's not just an old-fashioned arbitrary substitution for tells. That's actually expressing less commitment to the proposition that he will tell the truth than saying if he tells the truth, right? If he tell, without that S ending, is a subjunctive. And that's actually quite paralleled in the Old Norse, where the typical third-person indicative present ending are wouldn't be there in the subjunctive, as we'll see. And then in Shakespeare, you'll also often see the present subjunctive to the verb be, which is be, right? So if I be king, again, not just an old-timey way of saying am, but instead a way of committing less to the proposition of that being true than if I just did say am. So Old Norse has a much more robust living category of the subjunctive. Every verb can take the subjunctive. The number one single place where you're going to see this in reading Old Norse sagas and other narratives is going to be in reporting what someone else said. Not saying that someone else said it, that's indicative, that's the normal verb endings, right? He says, han segir. But what he said. Han segir at þeir se vikingar. He says that they are Vikings. Se is the subjunctive instead of eru, the normal indicative, present plural to be. He says they're Vikings. I don't know that they're Vikings. This might just be in his head. Remember, we can think of subjunctive as being the verb of what's in someone's head. I'm not committing to the truth proposition that they're Vikings, but I'm committed to the truth that he said it. Hence, segir is indicative, normal endings. Subjunctive is reserved for things I'm not committing to the truth of. Another place, as I said, that you might see that is in assumptions. So, Old Norse is going to use typically the verb geta, which looks like our get, to mean guess or assume. So, like þess getur til, þú hafir sett hann, I assume that you've seen him. Get is indicative, is normal inflection, because I really do assume it. But what I'm assuming is that you've seen him, and I'm not sure that you have, so that's subjunctive. So I'm using the subjunctive havir, not the normal indicative hevir, for you've seen. Notice the subjunctive there isn't going to have the I mutation. Or for hoping or expecting, þess vantak at þú hafir sett hann. I expect that you've seen him, or I hope that you've seen him. Same deal. It's not something that I know, right? It's this subordinated clause. And subjunctions aren't always in subordinated clause if you're familiar with the concepts of independent and subordinated clauses, but they're very often in subordinated clauses. I.e., the phrase that has a subjunctive verb often couldn't stand on its own as a sentence. What does it say? Liquid detected in lightning connector? Disconnect, allow the connector to dry? God damn it. Now, subjunctive endings are reasonably easy. They go a, ir, I, im, ir, I. Notice there's a lot of I's there. Everything ends in I, except for the first person singular, which in the present tense will look like the verb's infinitive, right? So, ek fara, like I might go, subjunctive, looks exactly like at fara, to go. But then the other personal endings all end in an I. Now, in Old Norse, that I becomes very psychologically salient to speakers, apparently, as the marker of the subjunctive. So by late Old Norse, and in modern Icelandic, the first person singular also gets an I, right? So modern Icelandic, the subjunctive first person present of fara is ég fari, right? Not ég fara. So be aware of that if you happen to be reading particularly late texts, or if you're trying to learn modern Icelandic alongside, or if you already know modern Icelandic, or maybe if you're just reading an Old Norse text and a modern Icelandic edition where they often modernize spellings. It's part of why Icelanders often think that Old Norse is more like modern Icelandic than it is. It's because they read it with modern Icelandic spellings. Now, subjunctive verb endings are the same for all verbs, and they are the same in present and past. What gets a little bit difficult with them is the I mutation factor. So, verbs that have I umlaut in the normal present, meaning strong verbs, and if you've, I'm just going to say strong verbs now, strong verbs don't have I mutation in the present subjunctive. So, Han kommer, he comes, but han komi is the present subjunctive. So notice in Old Norse, we can make a difference between if han kommer, if he comes, I'm pretty sure he will, and then subjunctive, if han komi, right? If he comes, if he might come, it's not perhaps particularly likely if I'm using the subjunctive. If you think, this is what made me pause when I was talking about strong verbs, if you maybe think about verbs like segia, where there is I umlaut in the present, even though they're weak verbs, that doesn't count in this case. Those will still have I umlaut because the J is part of the root, right? So the present subjunctive of, say, segia, say, is still segia, segir, segi, segim, segith, segi. But in the same class, hava, you have ek hava, havir, havi, havim, havid, havi. So that loses I umlaut. These are the so-called ya class verbs, what I call ya verbs. So they will, like strong verbs, not have I mutation in the present, except in the case of something like segia, where there's a J at the end of the root before the infinitive ending a, because that J will keep the I mutation there, even in the subjunctive. And then, additionally, strong verbs are going to have I mutation of the root in the past subjunctive. So will weak verbs that are not of the a type, like kala svara. Kala svara don't have I mutation in the past subjunctive. But strong verbs, geva, verda, taka, and then I type weak verbs. So your hyra, mala, and your ya type weak verbs, hava, segia, are going to have I mutation in the past subjunctive. This will be I mutation of the past form of it, and in the case of strong verbs, the past plural form of the root, right? Sometimes with strong verbs you have a different past singular from past plural, right? Han varð, but they're urdu from the verb verða. Well, it's urdu, the plural, that is going to be the form of the root that's going to get I mutated to form the subjunctive form of that verb, even in the singular past. Okay. So, I mentioned verða. That's a good example to look at for a minute. Verða is to become, right? So we have present tense han verður, past tense singular han varð, past tense plural þeir urðu. So, the form of the root that we're going to use for the basis of the past subjunctive is urð, but we're going to I mutate it, giving us urð with a Y, and then we're going to add our typical subjunctive endings. So past subjunctive, ek urða, þú urðir, hann urði, ver urðim, þeir urðið, þeir urði. Right, so ef hon urði, if she became. Right. Think about geva for a moment. What would you do with that? Pause if you need to think about it. There we have present han gefur, past singular han gav, past plural þeir govu. So we're going to I mutate gov and get gav. So past subjunctive, ek gava, þú gavir, hann gavi, ver gavim, þeir gavið, þeir gavi. Right? I hope that's reasonably clear. Let's practice with some more strong verbs because these are the hardest. I'm just going to ask you about a strong verb. Pause the video if you want to take a moment to sort of figure at it, and then start it again when you want to hear my answer. All right. What would be the present and past subjunctive endings of draga, drag, pull, draw? Now, present indicative normal endings, ek dreg, þú dregur, hann dregur, við drogum, þið dragið, þér draga, but we're not going to have any I mutation, or U mutation for that matter, in the subjunctive. So we get ek draga, thu dragir, han dragi, ver dragim, their dragið, their dragi. Now, notice I mutation is named for an I that was once in the unstressed syllable that mutated the vowel in the preceding syllable. And so you might look at this and say, why do all of these I's not mutate the A in that root, right? Why is there an ek draga, thu dragir? Well, because in late Proto-Norse, early Old Norse, when I mutation occurred, those were not I's, they were E's. And E never caused I mutation. It didn't become an I until after I mutation was a living sound change in the language. Now, what would be the past subjunctive of draga? Well, we have past singular handro, past plural their drogu. So it's drog that we're going to I mutate to get our past subjunctive root. So we have ek droga, thu drogir, han drogi, ver drogim, their drogid, their drogi. With that vowel spelled however the particular edition that you're reading spells it. How about ganga? What would you say for the present subjunctive? All right, so our regular present indicative endings have I mutation, right? Ek gang through ganger, but we're not going to have I mutation in the present subjunctive. The first person singular present subjunctive is going to look just like the infinitive. So, ek ganga through gangir, han gangi, ver gangim, ver gangid, ver gangi. How about the past subjunctive of ganga? All right, so we have past indicative han gek, and then past indicative third person plural gengu or gingu, typically gengu. So their gengu, they walked. Past subjunctive would then be, basing it on gang, ek ganga through gangir, han gengi, ver gengim, their gengith, thou gengi. Because the E there is not the product of I mutation like it is in the present indicative. It is just the past plural ending, so that's what's going to be used. And there's no I mutation of E, at least not in the way this means in Old Norse. So that's why it's ganga, ganger, gengi. How about fo? Similar to ganga, worth mentioning because it's so common. What's the present subjunctive? This might seem like a trick question because, of course, we have a verb root that ends in a vowel, and then we're going to add a bunch of vowel initial endings. Well, here we're going to have some vowel collapses. So long A always just collapses to long A. That's why the infinitive of fo is fo and not fo-a. So that general rule that the first person present subjunctive looks exactly like the infinitive is going to hold here. Ek fo. And then you get foir, foi, foim, foith, foi. How about the past subjunctive of fo? Well, in the regular indicative endings, we have han fek, their fengu. So again, like ganga and gengu, we're going to use fengu, and we're going to have ek fenga through fengir, han fengi, their fengim, their fengith, and thou fengi. All right. For the heck of it, let's look at a weak verb like svara, answer. This is much easier. I just want to convince you that it's easier after all that. So what would be the present subjunctive of svara? Okay, again, present subjunctive, first person, present, same as the infinitive. So ex svara, and then svarir, svari, svarim, svarith, svari. And then in the past tense, what would you get for that? This would be ex svarada, svaradir, svaradi, svaradim, svaradid, svaradi. Remember, if you thought it might be svorud, that the svorud is only because of the U mutation that's caused by the U's that are in the endings of the past plural and the regular indicative. That U is gone, so the root is just going to revert to the saying this in the singular, svarad. That's what we're going to add our subjunctive endings to. All right. And keep in mind with preterite present verbs that in the present, they look like past tense strong verbs. The same thing is true in their present tense subjunctive, which is going to look like the past tense subjunctive of a strong verb. So, ekskal, but ver skulum, it's the school that's going to be the basis for the present subjunctive of skulu, because it's like the plural past tense of a strong verb. So we're going to get skula, skulir, skuli, skulim, skuli, skuli. And in fact, that's a verb you see in the subjunctive a whole lot. Same thing with something like thorva, need, ektharv, ver thorvum. It's thorv that's the basis of the subjunctive present. So ek thurva, and then thurvir, thurvi, thurvim, thurvi, thurvi. I'll have some more exercises at the end so you can practice some more of this stuff. All right. So, again, keep in mind that subjunctive endings, to go back to something we were talking about at the very beginning, are added not to the verb of saying or thinking or assuming or hoping, but to the thing said or thought or hoped. So let's look at a bunch of sentences. A lot of these are going to be from the first chapters of Volsunga Saga. And let's think about why verbs are in the indicative or the subjunctive. It's good to think about this stuff out loud. This is actually a subject where it's great to actually have a classroom and people there who can ask questions live and things like that, because you never know if your examples and such are helping when you are never going to see the people watching you. Thes get ik til at nu muni uppi sogor thinar. And if you want to do an extra level of practice here, you can pause and translate these sentences before I give you translations or explain the translations. So I assume that your stories will now be up, right, with our typical Old Norse elision of the verb vera, be, and uppi means something is known, it's told, it's public. So your stories are going to be public. So get, assume, it's regular indicative, but muni, subjunctive, subjunctive present, but it is a preterite present verb. Now, we expect muni with a Y, but very often in these preterite present verbs, especially munu and skulu, even Old Norse writers get confused about what the indicative and the subjunctive is, so you'll fairly often see these without I mutation, even when they have subjunctive endings, right? You expect muni. Here we're seeing muni. Muni would be, quote-unquote, more correct, but plenty of Old Norse writers don't remember this with munu and skulu. Þó segir þrælinn hafi verið morgum frjálsum betri. Though someone, generally the public, says, the slave has been better than many free men. So I hope you're getting used to the words that Old Norse likes to leave out. There's no stated subject to segir, says, and there's no noun on morgum frjálsum. It's just many free, but in context we can assume it's many free men. So segir, says, is indicative. Havi, the thing said, is subjunctive, right? It's not hever, but havi. Han mælir að han skuli koma vetrin. He says that he shall come during the winter. Says, mælir is indicative, skuli is subjunctive. Notice koma, the infinitive, is not, right? There's no subjunctive endings for infinitives. And there we have the correct, historically speaking, I mutation in skuli, although you could see skuli and it wouldn't be shocking. Ek hug at hon dui. I think that she is dying. So hig is indicative, doi subjunctive. I'm not certain she's dying. I'm just thinking that way, right? Instead of the indicative doir, which would indicate she's surely dying. By the way, there will be exceptions for things that are said being in the subjunctive. One big exception is in just pure commands. So, Thal segir konungur at þeir skulu egi fara með honum. And then the king says that they shall not go with him, since we're reporting something that he's ordering, right? He's not reporting that they're not going with him. He's saying, you're not going to go with me. Then there's no reason to put it in the subjunctive, because that's command, not some kind of indirect report or narration. And then, by the way, consider that actual direct quotes, if I'm directly quoting what someone says, I'm not going to put it in subjunctive. Thigig thought, segir han. I receive it, he says. The thig is indicative because I'm just quoting him. Egir thought hera, segir Ivar. The is subjunctive, is indicative, not subjunctive. So, having mentioned I may also mention that, as usual, the verb be is strange, because being the most common verb in the language, it is going to hold on to unusual inflectional forms in ways that words that you don't see very often aren't going to. So, the subjunctive present tense root of the verb be is say. Unfortunately, long E is going to have some mutational interactions with the subjunctive present endings. So what we're going to actually wind up with in the present subjunctive is exio, which means, like, if I be looks like the verb see, right, sio. That also looks like an archaic form of the pronoun this. So sio can be multivarious. And then thu ser, that se, versem, versed, thou se. And the reason none of those have I's in them is that long E plus I, the I will drop. And then the reason why the first person is sio, not seya, is that ea always becomes yo. That's why the verb to see is sio, not seya. Although in Old East Norse, it's seya. Hence you have Swedish at se, but Norwegian Nynorsk, Western Norwegian dialects, osio, from this mutation that occurs in West Norse, including Old Icelandic, which is what our standard Old Norse texts are in. Luckily, the past tense subjunctive of be is normal, and the past tense subjunctive of be is the single subjunctive verb that you're most likely to see. So there we're going to have ekvara, right, because our past tense plural normal indicative is vorum, vorut, voru, so vor, I mutated to var. So vara, varir, vari, varim, varit, vari. And this is exactly the equivalent of English were as a subjunctive ending. It's not actually from the plural, it's from the old subjunctive that was cognate with Old Norse, vari. So you can often translate vari as would be, and it's often used in that way. So for example, hon vari vis til at taka það. She would be wise to take it. Vari is so common in that use that you will see it in main clauses pretty often. If you can't figure out another reason for the verb to be subjunctive, try translating vari as would be and see if the sentence makes sense. It often will. But of course, it's also used in all the normal subjunctive ways, like reporting indirect speech. Þeir sögðu at annar ormur væri undir gulinu. They said that another serpent was under the gold. They're reporting it, so was is subjunctive rather than indicative. Mér datt strax í hug at þessar kýr væri huldufólks eigin. It immediately occurred to me, dropped in my head, that these cows were the hidden folks' own.